Behind the pristine white columns of southern mansions, beneath the veneer of Christian virtue and maternal devotion, lurked predators whose crimes would make hardened criminals recoil in horror. These were not the rough overseers or brutish. Master's history remembers these were the ladies of the house, the supposed paragons of moral purity who by day supervised prayer meetings and charitable works, yet by moonlight transformed into sexual predators of the most depraved variety. What drives a woman raised on biblical scripture and societal refinement to hunt children in the slave quarters? How does a 15-year-old bride evolve into a monster capable of infanticide to protect her reputation? The truth buried beneath centuries of romanticized Southern mythology reveals a systematic culture of sexual violence where the most vulnerable became prey to those society deemed most virtuous. This is not merely a tale of historical aberration. It is an exposition of how absolute power, when married to sexual frustration and racial hatred, births demons wearing the masks of angels. If this dark revelation intrigues you, do subscribe for more forbidden histories that challenge everything you thought you knew about the past. The transformation from innocent bride to sexual predator began with a wedding veil at 15. These young women, barely past childhood themselves, were thrust into marriages that were little more than gilded cages. Their husbands planters, whose wealth was built upon human miseries, their wives as ornamental possessions, is no different from the fine china displayed in their drawing rooms. Mary Boykin Chestnut, whose diary would later expose the grotesque hypocrisy of plantation life, married at 17 and quickly discovered the bitter reality of Southern matrimony. Whilst she maintained the facade of the devoted Christian wife, her husband James openly conducted affairs with enslaved women, fathering mixed-race children who ran through the very halls where Mary entertained guests with tea and scripture readings. The psychological torment was exquisite in its cruelty. These women were forced to smile graciously as their husbands' illegitimate offspring served them at table, each mulatto face a living reminder of marital betrayal. They watched their husbands' lavish attention and often freedom upon enslaved mistresses whilst they themselves remained prisoners of societal expectation, forbidden from expressing rage or seeking solace elsewhere. The isolation was absolute. When husbands departed on business trips lasting months, these women were left alone with their burning resentments and awakening desires. The prescribed role of the virtuous Southern lady demanded sexual purity and emotional restraint, yet their bodies and minds rebelled against such constraints. The suffocating silence of plantation nights, surrounded by hundreds of human beings they legally owned. A monstrous idea began to take root. Legal documents from colonial South Carolina reveal that women possessed explicit rights to own, sell, and discipline enslaved persons. The 1740 Slave Code granted mistresses the same authority as masters over their human property, including the power to order mutilation for repeated escape attempts. This legal framework provided the perfect cover for what was to come a systematic exploitation of power that would make the devil himself blush with shame. Yet even as frustration and loneliness consumed them, these women maintained their masks of Christian virtue. The contradiction would prove fatal to their humanity, transforming them into creatures far more dangerous than their philandering husbands could ever be. The slave quarters became hunting grounds where Christian morality died screaming in the darkness. These women, denied agency in their own bedchambers, sought dominion over the bodies of those who could not refuse them. The methodology was calculated, predatory, and utterly without mercy. Enslaved girls as young as 14 found themselves targeted by mistresses whose outward piety masked an insatiable hunger for control. Harriet Jacobs, whose harrowing memoir Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl exposed these atrocities, described the systematic corruption of innocence. Young girls were first approached with gifts and false kindness, their natural trust exploited, by women who understood precisely how to manipulate vulnerability. When bribery failed, the true horror began. These mistresses employed the same brutal tactics as their male counterparts: flogging, starvation, and psychological torture designed to break the spirit completely.
Ow.
The difference lay in the perverse intimacy of female cruelty. Where male masters might rape with swift brutality, Mistresses savored the psychological destruction, relishing each tear, each plea for mercy. Each moment of resistance crushed beneath their authority. The legal system provided perfect cover for these crimes. Southern law granted mistresses absolute power over their human property, including the right to inflict physical punishment without oversight. A young enslaved girl found herself trapped between the advancing advances of master and mistress alike. Her body, a battlefield where different forms of violation converged with horrifying regularity. Captain Richard Hinton's testimony reveals the scope of this abuse. I have never found a bright-looking colored man whose confidence. I have one who has not told me of instances where he has been compelled either by his mistress or by white women of the same class to have a connection with them. The calculated selection of victims, always those most brutalized and powerless, demonstrates the strategic cruelty at work. These women understood that by targeting the most vulnerable slaves, those already broken by repeated abuse, they minimized the risk of exposure, whilst maximizing their psychological dominance. The enslaved victim, already stripped of legal protection, faced an impossible choice: submit to repeated sexual assault or face accusations of rape against a white woman, a charge that meant certain death. The slave quarters echoed with whispered warnings passed from mother to daughter, yet there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide from predators who held the power of life and death. The reversal of traditional sexual dynamics created a particularly grotesque form of violation. Enslaved men found themselves prey to women who wielded their supposed virtue as a weapon more deadly than any overseer's whip. These mistresses denied sexual agency in their marriages, discovered intoxicating power in forcing themselves upon men, with no legal right to refuse. The selection process was chillingly calculated. Mistresses deliberately chose the most psychologically broken slavesmen, already destroyed by repeated beatings, family separations, and systemic dehumanization. Harriet Jacobs witnessed such a predator select the most brutalized slave over whom her authority could be exercised with less fear of exposure. This strategic cruelty ensured silence while satisfying their twisted need for absolute dominance. The psychological warfare was exquisite in its malevolence. These women understood that their victims faced an impossible paradox: resist and face torture or death, submit and become complicit in their own violation. The threat of false rape accusations hung over every encounter like an executioner's blade. Southern society's obsession with protecting white feminine virtue meant that any enslaved man accused of impropriety faced certain death, often by lynching or burning alive. Contemporary observers noted the brazenness of these crimes. William Harding, a northern visitor, expressed shock at witnessing enslaved men wearing only a loose shirt descending halfway down their thighs, waiting on ladies who did not express any apparent embarrassment. The sexual tension was deliberately cultivated. A perverse theater where white women exercised the forbidden agency denied them in legitimate society. The aftermath was silence bought with terror. Mistresses secured their victims' compliance through threats that exploited the racial dynamics of slavery. Speak of this, they would whisper after their violation, and I shall claim you forced yourself upon me. The enslaved man, knowing that his word meant nothing against that of a white woman, became trapped in a web of complicity and shame. Charles Paul's autobiography records his affair with a planter's daughter. His pregnancy could not be concealed. The girl was degraded from her rank in society, and her child was sold into slavery. Yet Paul faced far worse: the constant threat of death should their liaison be discovered. The knowledge that her desire could become his death sentence at any moment. The communion between predator and prey created a unique form of psychological bondage that transcended even the physical chains of slavery. When illicit desires bore forbidden fruit, true depravity of these women revealed itself in acts of infanticide that would shame Medea herself. Mixed-race children, living evidence of their mother's crimes, faced a fate more horrific than slavery: systematic extermination to preserve white reputations. The methods employed to conceal these pregnancies demonstrated chilling premeditation. Contraceptive devices, crude but effective, were fashioned from animal skins, oiled silk, and rubber. Yet when prevention failed, these women resorted to solutions that stripped away any pretense of maternal instinct. Children born of these unions were either murdered outright, abandoned to die of exposure, or sold into the deepest recesses of slavery where their origins could never be traced. Paul's testimony illuminates the cold calculation behind these decisions. The planter's daughter who bore his child was not permitted to nurse it being taken from her, and the infant was immediately sold into slavery. The mother's punishment, social degradation, paled beside the child's sentence of lifelong bondage. Yet this represented mercy compared to alternatives that remained whispered, secrets in plantation records. The psychological violence extended beyond murder to encompass a grotesque perversion of motherhood itself. These same women who killed their own illegitimate children simultaneously exploited the maternal bonds of enslaved women with sadistic precision. They forcibly separated enslaved mothers from their infants, commandeering their milk to nourish the legitimate heirs, whilst their own children starved. Harriet Jacobs recalled her own mother being weaned at 3 months old, so that the babe of the mistress might obtain sufficient food. This practice, wet nursing by force, represented a uniquely feminine form of cruelty that weaponized the most sacred biological function. The enslaved mother watched helplessly as her body sustained her oppressor's child, whilst her own infant wasted away from malnutrition. The irony was exquisite and deliberate. Women who murdered their own mixed-race offspring for the sake of reputation simultaneously stole the life-giving milk meant for enslaved children. In this perverse economy of maternal resources, white virtue was purchased with black suffering, and the very act of nurturing became an instrument of torture. Yet even these horrors were merely prelude to the systematic campaign of terror these mistresses would wage against those who dared to remember their crimes. The maintenance of these unspeakable secrets required a restructure of violence so pervasive it transformed entire plantations into chambers of perpetual terror. These mistresses, having tasted the intoxicating power of sexual dominance, evolved into architects of systematic torture whose cruelty surpassed even that of their male counterparts. Solomon, God. Northrop's harrowing account reveals the calculating nature of this violence. He witnessed Patsy, an enslaved woman, subjected to relentless persecution by a mistress. Consumed with jealousy over her husband's sexual predations, the mistress often urged her husband to sell Patsy, or to have her whipped, and when direct action proved insufficient, she attempted to bribe Northrop himself to commit murder. The jealousy was not born of love but of wounded pride, the rage of a woman who saw her own sexual exploitation mirrored in that of her enslaved rivals. The violence took forms both subtle and savage. Mistresses forced enslaved people to serve them whilst naked under the pretense of bathing or massage, savoring the humiliation while satisfying their voyeuristic appetites. They ordered public floggings of unclothed slaves, combining the spectacle of punishment with the perverse pleasure of exposed flesh. The line between discipline and sexual gratification dissolved entirely. Mary Doykin Chestnut's diary entries expose the psychological gymnastics these women employed to justify their crimes. She simultaneously condemned slavery as a wrong and an inequity whilst characterizing enslaved women as prostitutes, as though their victimization somehow made them complicit in their own abuse. When witnessing a mixed-race woman being sold for sexual purposes, Chestnut felt faint, seasick, yet described the victim as lasciviously ogling the bitters with an expanded grin of excitement, projecting her own shame onto the very woman whose suffering she witnessed. This willful blindness extended to their own crimes. These women crafted elaborate justifications for their actions, casting themselves as the true victims, whilst their actual victims suffered in silence. They weaponized their supposed moral superiority using Christian rhetoric to justify the most unchristian acts imaginable. The most chilling aspect was the systematic nature of this terror. These were not isolated incidents of passion or madness, but calculated campaigns designed to maintain absolute control through fear. Every enslaved person on the plantation understood that resistance meant not merely punishment, but annihilation of themselves, their families, their very memory. In the end, these mistresses succeeded in creating something more effective than any physical prison, a psychological hell where hope itself became a luxury too dangerous to afford. The horrors unveiled in this grim chapter of Southern history expose a chilling truth. Beneath the facade of Christian virtue and Southern gentility, a monstrous culture of sexual violence thrived, orchestrated by women's society revered as paragons of morality. These mistresses, shaped by the suffocating constraints of their roles and fueled by absolute power, transformed from young brides into predators who preyed on the most vulnerable. Their crimes, sexual predation, infanticide, and psychological torture reveal the devastating consequences of unchecked authority married to personal and racial resentments. This was not merely a betrayal of humanity, but a systematic perversion of it, cloaked in the sanctity of plantation life. By unmasking these forbidden histories, we confront the uncomfortable reality that evil often wears the mask of virtue. The legacy of these atrocities demands we question romanticized narratives of the past and acknowledge the silent suffering of those who endured this terror. Subscribe for more revelations that challenge history's sanitized myths and honor the resilience of those who survived its darkest shadows.